Islam, Moorish. How y'all feeling today, all right? Good. We have a guest speaker later on, Zion Lexx, giving a good disposition on the Torah, ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, so have your pens and paper ready, ask questions so you can get clarity. I'm going to start off reading from our Circle 7 Quran. And for those of you who don't know, the Circle 7 Quran talks about the 18 missing years of Jesus Christ's life, or Yeshua, which is not in the biblical text. But these are lessons. So when you read this particular piece of literature that the prophet divinely prepared for us, don't necessarily take it as an historical fact, but more allegorical, codified lessons in life that you can learn for yourself, for your growth and development. All right? Life is all about learning about yourself. Study self. The prophet always stated, study self. Look in the mirror, study self. Know thyself and thy father God Allah. The genealogy of Jesus with 18 years of the events, life works, teachings in India, Europe, and Africa. These events occurred before he was 30 years of age. These secret lessons are for all those who love Jesus and desire to know about his life works and teachings. Dear readers, do not falsify, use these lessons. They are for good. Peace, happiness for all those that love Jesus. Dear mothers, teach these lessons to your little ones, that they may learn to love instead of hate. Dear fathers, by these lessons you can set your house in order, and your children will learn to love instead of hate. The lessons of this pamphlet are not for sale, but for the sake of humanity, as I am a prophet and the servant is worthy of his hire. You can receive this pamphlet at an expense. The reason these lessons have not been known is because the Muslims of India, Egypt, and Palestine had these secrets and kept them back from the outside world, and when the time appointed by Allah, they loosened the keys and freed these secrets. And for the first time in ages have these secrets been delivered in the hands of the Muslims of America. All authority and rights to this publishing of the pamphlet, 1927. So again, there are Muslims in India, Europe, Africa. All right? And as the prophet stated in his lessons, in the old prophecies, Muslims are born, not made. All right? So when you're in the womb of your mother for those 9 months, that muscle man, that Muslim is being designed, muscles and tissues, ligaments. All right? That's where the etymology of it comes from. As original melanated people. All right? Now, another piece of literature that comes out of Moorish Science Temple of America is the Quran Questions for Moorish Americans, or what they call the 101s. All right, again, when you read this information, don't so much as take everything as being literal, but understand that there are codified allegorical lessons in them. So when the brother Zion Lexx come up here and speaks, he's going to be breaking down some of the codified understandings of Hebrew versus English. I just recently had a discussion with a sister, and she was pretty much defending the English dialect over the ancient Hebrew. She said, well, this is what we learn in the church, so I'm taking it from this perspective. But don't you think it was the reason why, when our ancestors were kidnapped and held as slaves, that they took away these ancient tongues? Can you invoke the same power of the Most High that you can with English? Nope. That you can with ancient Hebrew, Aramaic? I don't think so. When you go to Chinatown, them Asians, they speaking their Mandarin amongst themselves. They ain't going into the English. When them Africans come here, they ain't throwing away, the Wolof in the Igbo and the Yoruba language. They speaking their ancient tongue. But they'll give you the dumbed down English, but they know to invoke the power of the Most High and the ancestors, so on and so forth. They're going into those ancient tongues. Now, the back of the 101s, it talks about our authority. And it states that the Moorish Science Temple of America deriving its power and authority from the great Quran of Muhammad. That's what it states on the back of the 101s. So sometimes when people read this piece of literature, I have one translated by Yusuf Ali, they automatically assume that the Moors are going to be practicing the Arab Pale version of Islam. You know, Prophet Muhammad didn't create Islam. Islam has no birth record, because Islam means what? Peace. All right, peace was here before, you know, peace be upon him, the Prophet Muhammad. But let's take a look if there's any references to any type of Mosaic law, Judaic law, in the Holy Quran. Now this is Surah 62, verses 4 through 9 in the Holy Quran of Mecca. In my Quran, this is page 1546. It states that such is the bounty of God, which he bestows on whom he will, and God is Lord of the highest bounty. The similitude of who were charged with the obligations of the Mosaic law, but who subsequently failed in those obligations is that of a donkey, which carries huge tombs but understands them not. Evil is the similitude of people who falsify the signs of God, and God guides not people who do wrong. So again, it states that those who fail to obligations of Mosaic law, that of a donkey, that of a jackass. We're going to read another reference. This is Surah 40, verse 23. This is page 1268 in the Holy Quran of Mecca. Verse 23 states, of old we sent Moses with our signs and our authority manifest. So here it references in the Holy Quran of Mecca that they brought Moses with the authority manifest as a lawgiver. As we referenced before, we showed and proved how some of these laws came from the laws of Hammurabi prior to, but at the end of the day, he still was one of the individuals who brought forth the law. This is referenced in the Holy Quran of Mecca. So you can see they're holding Mosaic law and Moses in high esteem, even among the Muslims. And one thing we have to understand is that when you're dealing with the continent of Africa, you have many Hebrews who migrated from the land of Canaan, from the Levant area, and migrated and settled in West Africa. It's a book from Babylon to Timbuktu. If you don't have that book gives beautiful points of references of Hebrews in West Africa. There was a Hebrew brother by the name of Elias Equino who wrote down logs breaking down that he was Hebrew and that he was enslaved at one particular time. Now there's some other points of references showing the Hebrew-Moorish connection. in regards, especially in regards to language. Citing the world's major languages, edited by B. Comries, it is pointed out that most of the Berber languages exhibit Kemetic Cushitic revealed in their morphology, phonetics, and word orders. Although some Berbers have been linked to Celtic and Nordic origins by some French colonial era writers, lofty concludes that the linguistic and historical evidence shows that most Berber origins are more likely East African from the Cushites. He offers the following observations. The dry valley of southern Morocco is largely regarded as having been inhabited long before the Canaanite settlement of the 10th century BCE by a Cushitic people, by the Cushites, were there first, who were descendants of the Haradans, represent one of the largest Berber-speaking ethnic groups in Morocco. So here you see the Cushites, which is the foundation of ancient Kemet. They had been settling in Morocco. Several Moroccan family names, Kush, Kashani, for example, all denote Cushitic Ethiopian origins. A prominent village, Misrah, near the famed city of Fez, which we wear our headdress, is linguistically related to Mizraim, the name given to Egypt by the Cushites. So when you study ancient Kemet, you got to study the ancient Cushite Empire. And when you study the ancient Cushite Empire, you can see that's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, cultures and civilization dealing with ancient Hebrew culture, dealing with the Old Testament, so on and so forth, that they hold dear. Then it goes on to say with some more references, James Jackson, in his commentary on Morocco, historically log refers to Mayat as a Moorish term for a deceased person. Then they also go to say that the profound significance is that there are designations of Twa and Keons and peoples of South Africa as so-called pygmies, Bushmen, or Hattins. But in the case of the so-called Berbers, I will argue that the terms dominate use in the Eurocentric academy has largely been used to deliberately confuse the race of the preeminent significant Moors. In essence, too much of Europe's history, identity, and cultural growth is tied to these African people to allow them to remain as Africoid Africans. Within contemporary Mauritania, there are peoples who specifically identify themselves as Moors and descendants of Moors. Sheikh Anta Diop contended that these Moors were and are descendants of post-Islamic invaders. He stated, started from Yemen, the Moors conquered Egypt, North Africa, and Spain between the 7th and 15th centuries. From Spain, they fell back on Africa. Thus, the Moors are basically Muslims whose installation in Africa is quite numerous, and there are numerous manuscripts preserved by the principal Moorish families in Mauritania today. Manuscripts in which their genealogy is minutely traced since their departure from Yemen testify to their origin. Moors are therefore a branch of those who customarily to call themselves Semites. Diop cites the Moors' Yemen departure as an indication of their status in Africa. He says the Moors left Yemen in the 7th century to come to Africa. However, Diop also says that Yemen was a Negro Ethiopian colony and remained so until the birth of Muhammad. So here you have, the Moors in ancient Kush, in North Africa, so on and so forth. And it states that the language of Abyssinia is a living remnant of the ancient language of Yemen. Hence, the Yemenis represent an Afro-Asiatic people. All right? So he points that information out there. Islam. More references state that after pointing out the Canaanites are the same people as the Phoenicians, Diop informs us that the Canaanites were originally quote-unquote Negroes already civilized with whom nomadic, uncultured quote-unquote white tribes later mixed in later on. All right, the Penguin Atlas of Ancient History informs that Canaanite was a reference to the population and the language in the land of Syria, Palestine. The Atlas goes on to say that Amorites were a subdivision of Canaanite populace. When you hear about the Amorites, they're a subgroup of the Canaanite Phoenician people. The Amorites originally came from ancient Arabia around 1850 BCE and established dynasties at Damascus, Babylon, Assur, Aleppo, and Mari. The Atlas further states that at one time that they held the southern part of Sumer, Larsa, and the famed lawgiver, I was talking about the Mosaic law, but now they reference the famed lawgiver Hammurabi was an Amorite. Amorites are specifically noted in the Moorish Quran as sojourning brethren of the Moors, cited as Moabites and Canaanites. According to the 6th century Byzantine chronicler Procopius, the original inhabitants of contemporary Morocco came from Canaan and Phoenicia. Procopius says that these early Moroccans left their Phoenician homeland at the time of King David's wars, 10th century BCE. So here you have different references. All these people are interconnected and interrelated.
Sound like chapter 47.
Exactly. That's right. Yep. Chapter 47. It goes on to say that al-Bukhari and Ibn Khaldun present similar histories regarding the ancient settlers of the western Maghrib coming from Canaan into Phoenicia. Al-Bukhari also said that the Sanjati Berbers were Africans, quote-unquote blacks, who initially practiced Judaism until being overcome and absorbed by the Almoravids. These African Jews were also known as the Bifar. Significantly, both the Bifar and the Sanjati are linked to the early Ghanan rulers. See, they don't want to tell you that these early rulers of Ghana and all these places, a lot of them were descendants of the Bifar. They were originally Hebrews. The extent of all the historical evidence of familiar African ties to Semitic peoples even compelled Diop to say of the Jews and the Arabs, when I write that Arabs and Jews, the two ethnic branches known today as Semites, are mixtures of black and white, this is demonstrable historical truth long dissembled. Significantly, the term Hebrew comes from the Kemetic word apuru. The Egyptians used the word around the second millennium to describe all nomadic peoples, quote unquote. All right? This is another reference. This is page 54 in Othello's Children. In 1858, The Origin of North American Indians, author John McIntosh stated, the North American Indians are of Asiatic origin. McIntosh asserted that Shem descendants were responsible for the peopling of most of North America, coming from places in Asia such as China, Korea, but then he continues, of Ham, the third son, we have nothing to say at his posterity, except that in most references to the claims of the Carthaginians at a very remote period, suffice it to say now that the Ham was the founder of almost all African nations, that the Philistine and Canaanites in Asia. This is a reference from Martin Delany. Delany wrote, Martin Delany was a quote-unquote black nationalist, Freemason, so on and so forth. He said, the continent of America, an asylum for various nations of the earth, among the earliest, most numerous class were found their way to the New World were those of the African race, and it is now a certain to our mind beyond a peradventure that when this continent was discovered, there were found in Central America a tribe of quote-unquote black race of fine-looking people, having characteristics of color and hair, identifying them originally of quote-unquote African race, no doubt being a remnant of the Africans who were of the Carthaginian expeditions, who adventurously cast upon the continent in their memorable excursion to the great island after the sailing of many miles distant to the west pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar. Remember, Hannibal was a Carthaginian. Right. McIntosh also condemns, which he refers to several historians, and he has engaged in a fanciful event men like Gomara Larus and Lescarbart. Although he disagrees with them, McIntosh still identifies researchers who are arguing that America had been peopled by the Canaanites, which they were expelled from Asian lands by Joshua. All right, so when you study the Olmec civilizations, you can see that the Olmecs have a Canaanite bloodline connection. And we know that there were definitely expeditions and travels back and forth, because a lot of the mummies in ancient Kemet, they used cocaine to preserve the mummies. And we know cocaine is not, grown in Egypt or Kemet. That means they would have been getting that cocaine from South America, those herbs from South America. Expeditions going back and forth.
Don't they have mummies in Peru that's
right.
older?
Yeah, you have the Chinchorro mummies of Peru, Ecuador area, and a lot of those mummies are older than some of the mummies in Kemet. All right, and these are dark-haired, woolly-haired people. A lot of their physical characteristics have been preserved. So these are not pale European people that we see today. Now, also, last week I was going into the etymology and language, talking about swarthy, how swarthy means dark, things of that nature. These are some of the information that I broke down coming out of ancient and modern Britons, how places like Ireland, Great Britain was populated by dark-hued Asiatics in those particular places. And when you talk about the Americas, there were swarthy, dark people that are original inhabitants of the Americas prior to the European coming here. All right? Now, we teach about, in regards to politics and law, we teach about, Abraham Lincoln and the Four Proclamations. And we teach a little bit about Abraham Lincoln's history. Abraham Lincoln himself, although they make him look very pale-skinned, and regardless of what views you may have towards him, Abraham Lincoln was descended of an indigenous group that was a multicultural group called the Melungeons. Anybody heard of the Melungeons? Yeah. Right. Melungeons were people that came out of areas like Kentucky, West Virginia, so on and so forth. That's when I read a little bit of information about the Melungeons in reference to our people already being here in the Americas. Again, Abraham Lincoln was very controversial. He was described as being swarthy. He was descendants of the early European African Native American group. For years he lived in fear of harassment and fear of being enslaved due to their mixed ethnic heritage. Melungeon's family still exists today. They first appeared, as far as like European documenting these people being here, around 19th century as a triracial group in the Appalachian Mountains in that area. Some claim of Portuguese descent. Melungeons are descendants of free people of color. That was a legal term at one time. Free people of color. Chesapeake 17th century slavery, some were indentured servants. They would have to serve for a period of time, and then they would be set free. Now, based on Leviticus chapter 25, verse 10, on the 7th year, you would be set free from that indentured servitude. All right? That's inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. All right? Then it goes on to say that, again, the first official slave in the Chesapeake region was an indentured servant from Africa whose master was his fellow countryman back in Angola. The indentured servant, his name was John Kazar. He filed the custom when he was indentured was done in 1655, and he wanted to get his freedom, so he went to court to demand his freedom. His master was a wealthy free man of color by the name of Antonio Johnson, all right? Or otherwise known as Anthony Johnson. How many people know that there was a brother named Anthony Johnson who was on record as being one of the first slave owners in Virginia, all right? So that's contrary to what they've been telling us, that, we didn't own slaves, so on and so forth, all right? It was about status. So this case went to court, and they sent it to the judge that the caster agreed to serve him for the rest of his life. The judge ruled in favor of the wealthier man. The wealthier man was Anthony Johnson. That was the wealthier man. Again, he was an indentured servant who wound up having lifelong servitude as a slave. Now, once a few early cases of indentured servitude, slaves were on the legal books, all right, and planters and farmers, or even the colonies, began to see an opportunity to further enrich their expenses. You had, quote unquote, mixed race servants as well as free persons of color. And then in 1705, the Virginia Assembly enacted the slave codes, or the Christian black slave codes. You had the slave codes, you had the Christian black slave codes. Now they codifying this in law. This is, again, based on your status. Remember, when I talked about the Soon You Free Mosaic, they were of a dark hue, but they went to court and they wasn't enslaved. But you identify as a Negro, automatically you property. Those Negro Acts and those slave codes, they relate to you in the court of law. All right? And then I also mentioned the brother Billy Simmons. He was captain of South Carolina. He said, I'm not a Negro. He said, I'm descendant of the Bifar Hebrews. All right? It goes on to say, all servants imported, brought into the country who were not Christians in their native country shall be accounted to be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves within the dominion shall be held as real estate. So they were held in, our people who had that status as Negro, as chattel property, as real estate. Again, mixed race people had their property seized and received threats. This is one of the reasons why the Melungeons went into the mountains and things of that nature, because these were people who, again, they were triracial, very dark. Some of them were being held as slaves until they went and said, listen, we're not black, Negro, and colored. All right? You had some that were related to the Lenape who went into court and said that we're Moors. We're not Indians, black, or Negro, but we're Moors. And based on that status in law, again, going back to the Soon You Free Moors Act, they were freed and had the status of white. They weren't saying they were European, but that was a legal status. Free white person is a legal status. All right? Here's another article I have. It states, there's trouble between the United States and the government of Morocco, growing out of the arrest of a ranger of a Moorish Hebrew under American protection, and the refusal of the Sultan either to release him on demand of the United States consul or to recognize the longer treaty rights of Americans in his dominions. 2 United States men of war are on their way to the coast of Morocco by order of the president. Again, he was identified as a ranger, and he was identified as a Moorish Hebrew on record. And at that particular time, if you knew your status and if you had a connection to the Sultan of Morocco, they were using a treaty of peace and friendship, which was, again, Abdul Rahman utilized it, and also the Soon You Free Moors Act right in South Carolina. They utilized that in regards, in the court of law, saying we're not Negro, black, and colored. This is our particular legal status, regardless of their skin hue. It's the same thing with the William Dungy case. I stated that the Melungeons stated they were of Portuguese descent. William Dungy was represented by a Melungeon, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln used to be a lawyer. How many people know that? He was a lawyer. So when he went to court, they tried to classify William Dungy as a Negro because he was dark. And Abraham Lincoln stated, although he is dark and has the same skin hue as a Negro, he is of Moorish Portuguese descent. And he won his case, He was paid restitution and everything. So these are important historical references, court records that show and prove that status, how you identify yourself, does matter. We know that when people of the continent of Africa, when they travel here, it's a paper trail, and they passports don't say black, Negro, or colored. They come in here with language, nationality, and status. And again, a lot of those individuals, when you do your research, contrary to popular belief, a lot of them were under that understanding and dealing with Hebrew culture in West Africa, but they migrated to West Africa. Even when you talk about the Yoruba didn't originate in West Africa. They originated out of places like Yemen and Kush. Then they migrated to West Africa. All right? So with that, my time is about up, and I'm going to say peace.